Okay, so nothing exists in a bubble. The reason why any open world game with swords and sorcery is inevitably compared to Skyrim, and the concept of difficulty has somehow become a subgenre itself synonymous with Dark Souls, is precisely because inspiration, and borderline plagiarism if you ask Nintendo, naturally leads to association. It's also not the case for every entrant on this list that they were once considered the apex of their respective genres and subsequently fell out of favour when something superior came along and put it to shame. So let's talk about them today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 fantastic video games you should never play. Number 10, Destiny 2. The masterminds behind Halo had already departed Bungie by the time Destiny 2 rolled around. Still, the knowledge of how to forge best-in-class shmup mechanics is clearly something that runs deep in the studio's blood, as the latter feels like an evolution of Master Chief's golden years in almost every respect. That being the case, there are precisely zero negatives to give Destiny 2's core gameplay, if only the same could be said of the surrounding baggage that drags it down to the depths of Titan's impossible ocean. For every individual component of Destiny 2 that stands head and shoulders above its contemporaries, like raids, or imaginatively deep lore, or being a power fantasy like no other, so too do counterpoints so grievous exist they can't just be waved away as being irritating. As old as Destiny 2 is, it has become a case study of why the live service model isn't sustainable, chiefly in how its otherwise fantastic story has become a piecemeal, time-gated experience for players and a nonsensical mishmash of non-linear events for newbies. Pile on some horrifying microtransactions, neglected PvP, and cookie-cutter seasonal content, and you're left with nothing but an adventure that has long since turned its back on attracting new blood and only exists to keep existing Guardians returning to the treadmill once again. Number 9, League of Legends. Now, credit where it's due, Riot Games has made a concerted effort to remedy League of Legends' longest-running problem, despite it being, bluntly, unsolvable. Any MOBA's greatest strength and weakness is its player base. Now, League isn't alone in harbouring some of the absolute worst outwardly aggressive, socially inept creatures, but as the most successful of its contemporaries, exposure to unsavoury types such as this is naturally going to be more prevalent. It's an incredibly frustrating reality considering League's bread and butter 5v5 mode can devour hours of free time under the right parameters. Venture into Summoner's Rift with a pre-made group of friends and or acquaintances, and you are going to have a blast indulging in some strategic tug of war. But risk your sanity and queue up solo, however, and you will be chewed out for your slightest misstep. Any League regular will have developed a thick skin towards griefing and verbal abuse by now, but for anyone stepping into this for the first time, well, only pain and suffering await you, my friend. In a perfect world, fresh-faced competitors would be provided a haven in which to learn, practice, and develop the skills expected of anyone queuing up as a lone wolf. But smurfing, the act of veteran players creating new accounts to play and crush newbies, rife as it is, makes breaking onto the scene all but impossible. Number 8, Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. Hideo Kojima, bless him, was finally let loose from Konami's clutches following the release of Metal Gear Solid's 5th installment, but the soured relationship between the two parties had an indelible effect on the Phantom Pain. The first half of Venom Snake's romp across Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War represents the pinnacle of Metal Gear in every sense. Open-ended stealth that awards players agency to tackle objectives as they see fit in an open world culminates in a formula nurtured and perfected over decades. Snake and his retinue of diamond dogs' pursuit of Skullface hit the ground running and maintained a frantic pace for the first few dozen hours. Had quality persisted into Phantom Pain's second half, release review scores would have been wholly justified. But then the second act comes along and upends everything. The constant momentum building towards Skullface's demise gives way to a dull, repetitive, plodding mess that sees Snake sent back out into the field to grind out a laundry list of missions that the player has already completed hours previously, but now are just slightly more difficult. To add salt to the wound, Konami would follow up the dross of Phantom Pain's second act in 2018 with Metal Gear Survive, and that is just grim. Number 7, RuneScape III. Now, any game, MMO or otherwise, that maintains an active player base for more than 2 decades has done something right to stay relevant. To be fair, Jagex's accomplishments shouldn't be reduced to one singular reason for success, but the heart of its flagship title has long since been corrupted by an overabundance of mismanagement and aggressive monetization. The quintessentially British humour and folklore that inspired the game world still persist, and the sandbox nature of RuneScape truly gives players an open-ended approach to to how they progress. But these established pillars of gameplay have long since been diminished by complacency and diversion from a unique vision that has slowly slipped out of sight when creators Andrew and Paul Gower sold up and departed. What remains isn't so much of a shell of a game, but one that feels as though it has fallen into maintenance mode in favour of its sister title, Old School RuneScape. Exacerbating the existing issues, 20 years of continued updates have all but eliminated any ability for a newcomer to make head or tail of how any of its often archaic systems work. There are so many reasons to experience everything that RuneScape has to offer, but the barrier to entry is just simply far too vast a surmount for any but the most hardcore of MMO fans. Number 6. Dragon's Dogma. The 2010s were a dark age for Capcom, but there were a few diamonds in the rough that were released by the studio worth shouting about, and nobody expected Dragon's Dogma to take off the way it did. On paper, it masqueraded itself as a generic-looking action RPG with quirks in the form of scalable monsters and the pawn system. The result was a somewhat haphazard smashing together of the Elder Scrolls and Dark Souls, and yielded something that, to quote Todd Howard, just works. Capcom managed to stitch together bottomless build diversity, meaningful exploration, and a surprisingly memorable story in its first major attempt at an open-world RPG. But even in 2012, the cracks and obtuse nature of several design decisions were pretty obvious. Limited fast travel, a mind-melting quest system in conflict with itself, and a laughably awful UI have resulted in Dragon's Dogma becoming a victim of its age and a low budget. With a sequel finally on the way this year, we can only assume that what made Dragon's Dogma a mild nightmare to play today will be remedied with this successor. Number 5. Mass Effect III. BioWare fell right into the trap that all interactive storytellers need to be wary of with Mass Effect 3, and that was championing choice. Now, Commander Shepard's third and final outing delivered on the promise of a bigger and better sequel, boasting a more expansive galaxy, further meaningful interpersonal relationships for mankind's champion, and a perfected approach to combat. On its merits, Mass Effect 3 outshines the series' middle child at pretty much every avenue, bringing satisfying closure to a numerous ongoing storylines. Well, that is all except the central war against the Reapers. Distilling what had been progressively built up as an adventure where no one ending to Shepard's story would be identical even after hundreds or thousands of hours, falling at the critical last hurdle with an arbitrary choice between 3 outcomes. It's not often that a single aspect of an otherwise tremendous experience can be credited for souring everything that came before, but this ticks all of those boxes. Do yourself a favor and consider Mass Effect's original run to be a duology, because Mass Effect 2 really was the perfect place to leave things. Number 4. Lost Ark. Smilegate's MMO finally reached Western shores back in 2022, and almost overnight became one of Steam's biggest ever launches. Were the 5-digit login queues on release worth soldiering through? Well, that depends on who you ask, but anyone who stuck with Lost Ark through its wobbly first few weeks swiftly discovered why Arkeesia's population in its native Korea spanned hundreds of thousands of visitors. Sublime combat, intricately designed endgame encounters, and more build diversity than a capital city provided Lost Ark's staying power. It's as much a joy to play today as it was 2 years ago, but you know what? Experiencing the best of what the game has to offer is another matter entirely. Similar to other KMMOs, vertical gear progression is locked behind substantial RNG, with its horizontal counterpart less so, but still requiring hours upon hours of grinding to make your character presentable to other endgame players. If you lack any of the necessary upgrades, items, or titles to prove your worth, as it were, you're liable to be gatekept from even using the inbuilt party finder to join a group. You'll encounter this same issue on other MMOs, of course, but it's much more pronounced here. To catch up with others who have been playing for years, you'll need to go through the very same content that veterans did, but without the experience, leading to a vicious, never-ending cycle of applying and being denied from actually engaging with the best of what Lost Ark has to offer. Number 3. Grand Theft Auto Online. Now, don't listen to law-abiding citizens here, friends. Crime does pay. You just got to be good enough not to get caught. That's Grand Theft Auto Online's mantra, at least, and considering the number of multi-millionaires that you'll see zooming around Los Santos in public lobbies, career criminals are a dime a dozen. To be expected then, considering the whole crux of what makes GTO so addictive, that your fellow players aren't going to think twice about wasting you at a moment's notice. And it's one of many decisions made by Rockstar that's proven to be a double-edged sword ever since the service went live. Yes, you can kill whoever you want to kill, And while there are built-in systems to reward this type of behavior, such as stealing another player's illicit goods so you can sell them instead, for example, that same freedom also serves as a griefer's paradise. There are ways to tackle this behavior, but they all cost money, and that's something you'll be short on while taking those first few steps into GTAO's lawless frontier. To make any meaningful dough, you'll need to engage with the various activities spread out throughout the cities in public lobbies, but these make you an easy target. And yes, private lobbies exist, but if you find yourself resorting to that, well, you're better off just playing the single-player campaign, if I'm honest. Number 2, Final Fantasy XV. In a world where Final Fantasy VII Remake exists, taking a retrospective look at Final Fantasy XV delivers a far less favourable view of the troubled 15th installment years after release. While comparing the two wholesale isn't exactly fair, it is fair to assert that 15's combat system, stylish as it was, exists more as a prototype for what would eventually become 7 Remake's lauded modernisation of the Final Fantasy formula. Now, 15 isn't a one-trick pony. The land and its inhabitants are as gorgeous as ever, and until Rebirth comes along at least, the kingdom that you explore represents Square Enix's most accomplished world to date. Frustratingly though, a deeply disjointed narrative, a result of repeated development restarts, is still the biggest blemish on Final Fantasy XV. The tragedy of it all is that Noctis's road trip of self-discovery with buddies in tow against the backdrop of a continent on the precipice of war and infighting is still top-tier storytelling told in the worst possible manner. If you need a 2-hour animated movie to add much-needed context to an existing work, that's sign enough that problems were present from the very beginning. And number 1, the mainline Pokemon franchise. I mean, honestly, just play Pal World instead. I mean, that's mostly a jest, but the Pokemon Company and Nintendo could stand to learn a thing or two from a game that makes no secret of what globally popular franchise it is aping. Pokemon doesn't need guns, base building, or, well, any of the trappings of a survival game. I mean, that's not what it wants to be, nor should it. But what the Pokemon Company, and by extension Game Freak, should do, though, is not be so stubbornly opposed to innovation or change. The reluctance is understandable to a degree. I mean, why bother with reinventing the wheel when the core formula, largely unchanged since the 90s, still generates 9-figure sums with every new generation? Despite the outroar over its offensive performance issues, are proof enough that forgiveness is in good supply for Game Freak when its competitors would be spat out like used gum if it dared to ship anything so glaringly unfinished. Despite all of this, though, the central loop of catch, train, battle, and repeat is still oh so alluring to multiple generations of gamers. Every Pokemon game as a standalone experience is worth playing, but if you've dipped your toes into the franchise even as far back as Black and White, there's nothing that Gen 9 can offer you that you won't have seen before. It's just presented in a slightly prettier manner.